The entomologist's hand trembled as he pressed the bullet ant against his forearm, feeling the mandibles lock into place. What followed wasn't just pain, it was a complete system shutdown. A white-hot electrical storm that rewired every nerve ending in his body. He described it later, voice still shaking, as pure, intense, brilliant pain. Like walking over flaming charcoal with a 3-inch nail embedded in your heel. That was a 4 on the Schmidt Pain Index. But tonight, you're going to discover that the bullet ant isn't even close to the worst. Across remote jungles, forgotten islands, and even suburban backyards, there exist insects whose stings have driven people to madness. To the edge of cardiac arrest. And into hospital rooms where doctors have no protocol because the venom is so rare, so devastating, that modern medicine is still catching up. These aren't myths whispered around campfires. These are documented cases. Ranked by the only metric that matters, the absolute ceiling of agony a human nervous system can process before it breaks. If you're ready to feel the venom yourself, smash the like button and subscribe so you never miss what attacks next. The Schmidt Sting Pain Index wasn't born in a laboratory. It was born in screaming fits across the Amazon, in the swollen, blackened hands of field researchers who learned too late that some insects don't just defend themselves, they punish. Justin Schmidt, the entomologist who created the index, allowed himself to be stung by over 80 species of Hymenoptera, documenting each sensation with the precision of a wine critic tasting poison. His scale runs from 1 to 4, but those numbers are deceptive. A level 2 sting doesn't feel twice as bad as a level 1. It feels 10 times worse. A level 3 sting can make grown men weep openly. And a level 4. That's where we begin to understand that pain isn't just a warning system. It's a weapon, refined over millions of years to inflict maximum psychological damage. Coming in at number 10 is the Florida harvester ant, a creature most people walk past without a second glance. Schmidt rated it a solid 3, describing the sensation as bold and unrelenting, like someone is using a power drill to excavate your ingrown toenail. The venom contains a cocktail of alkaloids that do unjust your pain receptors. They keep them firing for hours, sometimes days. In 2019, a landscaper in Tampa accidentally knelt on a colony while trimming hedges. Within 90 seconds, he had 17 stings concentrated on his left kneecap. The pain didn't peak immediately. It built slowly, a rising tide of burning pressure that made him vomit twice before he even reached his truck. The swelling was so severe that doctors initially suspected a bone infection. 3 days later, his knee was still hot to the touch, the tissue beneath the skin cooking in its own inflammatory response. Number 9 belongs to the Maricopa harvester ant, a southwestern nightmare that holds the Guinness World Record for most toxic insect venom, ounce for ounce. Its venom is 12 times more lethal than a rattlesnake's. A single sting registers as a 3.5 on Schmidt's scale, but the real horror is cumulative dosing. In 1987, a hiker in Arizona sat on a nest without realizing it. By the time he stood up, over 300 ants had swarmed his lower back and thighs. The venom load was so massive that his body went into anaphylactic shock within minutes. Even though he had no prior allergy history, his blood pressure dropped, his airway began to close, and his heart started misfiring. Paramedics saved him, but the localized pain, the burning, grinding, relentless agony, lasted for 6 weeks. He described it as feeling like his skin was being slowly peeled off with pliers, layer by layer, while someone poured battery acid into the wounds. At number 8, we meet the Red Paper Wasp, a species so aggressive that entire neighborhoods have been evacuated when colonies nest near playgrounds. Schmidt gave it a 3, noting the sting was caustic and burning, with a distinctly bitter aftertaste. That last detail is real. The venom is so potent it can be tasted if it enters the bloodstream near salivary glands. In 2015, a woman in Georgia was stung 11 times while trying to knock down a nest with a broom. She made 2 critical mistakes. She did it alone, and she did it at dusk, when wasps are most defensive. The stings clustered around her neck and right shoulder, and within an hour she couldn't turn her head. The swelling compressed a nerve cluster, sending electric jolts down her arm for 3 months afterward. Physical therapy helped, but she still experiences phantom pain on humid days, a neurological echo of venom that's long gone. Number 7 is where things stop being about defense and start being about punishment. The giant Asian hornet worker, not the queen. Just the worker delivers what Schmidt called a deeply penetrating sting. Like a hot nail through flesh. These hornets are 2 inches long, with stingers that can punch through light fabric and even thin leather. In Japan, where they kill 30 to 50 people annually, there's a term for their sting: burning hell. A single worker injected a farmer in Shizuoka Prefecture with enough venom to cause rhabdomyolysis, a condition where muscle tissue breaks down and releases proteins into the blood that can shut down the kidneys. He survived, but not before spending 4 days in intensive care. His urine the color of cola, his body cannibalizing itself from the inside. The pain, he said, through a translator, felt like his bones were splitting open and someone was pouring molten glass into the marrow. And that was just one sting. Multiple stings from these creatures don't add up, they multiply. Each injection amplifying the last until the nervous system can't distinguish between pain signals anymore. It all becomes one continuous scream. But that's just where the suffering begins. The Schmidt Sting Pain Index wasn't born in a laboratory. It was born in screaming fits across the Amazon, in the swollen, blackened hands of field researchers who learned too late that some insects don't just defend themselves, they punish. Justin Schmidt, the entomologist who created the index, allowed himself to be stung by over 80 species of Hymenoptera, documenting each sensation with the precision of a wine critic tasting poison. His scale runs from 1 to 4, but those numbers are deceptive. A level 2 sting doesn't feel twice as bad as a level 1. It feels 10 times worse. A level 3 sting can make grown men weep openly. And a level 4. That's where we begin to understand that pain isn't just a warning system. It's a weapon, refined over millions of years to inflict maximum psychological damage. Coming in at number 10 is the Florida harvester ant, a creature most people walk past without a second glance. Schmidt rated it a solid 3, describing the sensation as bold and unrelenting, like someone is using a power drill to excavate your ingrown toenail. The venom contains a cocktail of alkaloids that do unjust your pain receptors. They keep them firing for hours, sometimes days. In 2019, a landscaper in Tampa accidentally knelt on a colony while trimming hedges. Within 90 seconds, he had 17 stings concentrated on his left kneecap. The pain didn't peak immediately. It built slowly, a rising tide of burning pressure that made him vomit twice before he even reached his truck. The swelling was so severe that doctors initially suspected a bone infection. 3 days later, his knee was still hot to the touch, the tissue beneath the skin cooking in its own inflammatory response. Number 9 belongs to the Maricopa harvester ant, a southwestern nightmare that holds the Guinness World Record for most toxic insect venom, ounce for ounce. Its venom is 12 times more lethal than a rattlesnake's. A single sting registers as a 3.5 on Schmidt's scale, but the real horror is cumulative dosing. In 1987, a hiker in Arizona sat on a nest without realizing it. By the time he stood up, over 300 ants had swarmed his lower back and thighs. The venom load was so massive that his body went into anaphylactic shock within minutes. Even though he had no prior allergy history, his blood pressure dropped, his airway began to close, and his heart started misfiring. Paramedics saved him, but the localized pain, the burning, grinding, relentless agony, lasted for 6 weeks. He described it as feeling like his skin was being slowly peeled off with pliers, layer by layer, while someone poured battery acid into the wounds. At number 8, we meet the Red Paper Wasp, a species so aggressive that entire neighborhoods have been evacuated when colonies nest near playgrounds. Schmidt gave it a 3, noting the sting was caustic and burning, with a distinctly bitter aftertaste. That last detail is real. The venom is so potent it can be tasted if it enters the bloodstream near salivary glands. In 2015, a woman in Georgia was stung 11 times while trying to knock down a nest with a broom. She made 2 critical mistakes. She did it alone, and she did it at dusk, when wasps are most defensive. The stings clustered around her neck and right shoulder, and within an hour, she couldn't turn her head. The swelling compressed a nerve cluster, sending electric jolts down her arm for 3 months afterward. Physical therapy helped, but she still experiences phantom pain on humid days, a neurological echo of venom that's long gone. Number 7 is where things stop being about defense and start being about punishment. The giant Asian hornet worker, not the queen. Just the worker delivers what Schmidt called a deeply penetrating sting, like a hot nail through flesh. These hornets are 2 inches long, with stingers that can punch through light fabric and even thin leather. In Japan, where they kill 30 to 50 people annually, there's a term for their sting: burning hell. A single worker injected a farmer in Shizuoka Prefecture with enough venom to cause rhabdomyolysis, a condition where muscle tissue breaks down and releases proteins into the blood that can shut down the kidneys. He survived, but not before spending 4 days in intensive care. His urine the color of cola, his body cannibalizing itself from the inside. The pain, he said, through a translator, felt like his bones were splitting open and someone was pouring molten glass into the marrow. And that was just one sting. Multiple stings from these creatures don't add up, they multiply. Each injection amplifying the last until the nervous system can't distinguish between pain signals anymore. It all becomes one continuous scream. But that's just where the suffering begins. Number 2 is the bullet ant. And if you've heard of any insect on this list, it's probably this one. But knowing its reputation and understanding what it actually does to the human body are 2 entirely different things. The bullet ant earns a perfect 4 on the Schmidt Pain Index, and Schmidt's description has become legendary: pure, intense, brilliant pain. Like walking over flaming charcoal with a 3-inch nail in your heel. Indigenous tribes in the Amazon use these ants in initiation rituals, weaving hundreds of them into gloves that young men must wear for 10 minutes to prove their manhood. Most pass out. Some have seizures. All of them emerge changed, not because they've conquered the pain, but because they've learned that pain has no upper limit, just keeps climbing until your consciousness cooled on anymore, and your brain shuts you down as an act of mercy. The venom contains ponerotoxin, a peptide that directly attacks the central nervous system by forcing sodium channels to remain open, causing neurons to fire uncontrollably. It's not a toxin designed to kill, it's designed to teach. In 2017, a documentary filmmaker in Brazil was setting up a camera near a nest when a bullet ant climbed onto his boot, up his pant leg, and stung him on the calf. He described the first 5 seconds as completely normal, just a sharp pinch. Then the ponerotoxin reached his spinal cord. He said later, it felt like someone had injected rocket fuel directly into his bone marrow, and now that fuel was igniting, spreading, consuming everything. His leg cramped so violently that the muscle tore a partial rupture of his gastrocnemius that required surgery weeks later. But that physical injury was almost incidental compared to the neurological warfare happening inside him. For 12 hours, he experienced waves of pain that peaked every 20 to 30 minutes, each crest higher than the last. He vomited 7 times. He begged his crew to cut off his leg. At hour 8, he started bargaining with God, offering anything: his career, his possessions, years of his life, just to make it stop. When it finally faded, 18 hours after the initial sting, he'd aged, not metaphorically. His hair had patches of white that hadn't been there before. Stress-induced depigmentation that his doctor said was consistent with extreme psychological trauma. But the bullet ant, for all its horror, has a predictable pattern. The pain peaks, plateaus, and eventually recedes. Number 1 doesn't follow those rules. The Executioner Wasp holds the unofficial crown. But there's a sting so rare, so catastrophically agonizing, that it exists in a category beyond Schmidt's scale entirely. We're talking about the Asian giant hornet queen. Not the workers we discussed earlier, the queen. She's 3 times their size, with a stinger nearly a quarter-inch long, and venom glands that have been marinating toxins for years, compounding and concentrating in ways that workers' glands never do. Queens almost never sting humans. They're too valuable to the colony to engage in defense. But when they do, when a nest is completely destroyed and the queen has no option but to fight, the results are biblical. In 2003, a farmer in rural China was clearing land with a small excavator when he accidentally dug directly into an underground hornet nest. The colony exploded outward, hundreds of workers, dozens of drones, and one queen, a creature the size of a small bird with wings that sounded like helicopter blades. The workers swarmed him first, delivering 63 stings before he could get back to his excavator cabin. That alone would have hospitalized most people. But then the queen, in a final act of colonial defense, landed on the back of his neck and drove her stinger in so deep it scraped his vertebrae. The farmer's screams were heard over a quarter-mile away. By the time his son reached him, he was convulsing, his body arching backward in full epistatanus, a tetanic spasm so severe his spine was bending at angles that should have caused fractures. The venom cocktail from a queen contains not just the neurotoxins and hemotoxins of worker venom, but also pheromonal compounds that mark the victim for further attack, and enzymatic proteins that begin pre-digesting tissue at the injection site. His son drove him 18 miles to the nearest hospital. And during that drive, the farmer experienced something that emergency physicians later documented in a case study: venom-induced temporal distortion. He perceived the 18-minute drive as lasting hours. Each second stretched into an eternity of burning, tearing, impossible pain. His body temperature spiked to 104 degrees Fahrenheit as his immune system went haywire. His kidneys began to fail as dead muscle tissue released myoglobin into his bloodstream. And the pain, the central, overwhelming fact of his existence for the next 72 hours, didn't peak and fade. It evolved. The initial electric shock sensation gave way to a deep, grinding ache that felt like his entire neck was being crushed in a vice. Then came the burning, a sensation he described as having molten metal poured into the wound. Then the itching, a maddening, unreachable itch beneath his skin that made him claw at his neck until nurses had to restrain his hands. He cycled through these phases without pattern, sometimes experiencing all 3 simultaneously. His nervous system so overloaded it was just firing every pain signal in its repertoire at random. On day 4, when he was finally coherent enough to speak in full sentences, he told the doctors he'd hallucinated an entire, alternate timeline where he'd died and gone to hell. And hell was just the sting repeating forever, with no hope of escape or ending. Psychiatrists who evaluated him later diagnosed acute PTSD. He sold his farm within 6 months, moved to the city, and now works in an office where the only insects he encounters are houseflies. He can't watch nature documentaries. He can't go near gardens. The sound of buzzing, even a electric razor or a distant motorcycle, sends him into panic attacks that require medication to control. This is what the #1 sting does. It doesn't just hurt you. It breaks something fundamental in your psyche, rewrites your relationship with your own body, and leaves a scar that exists not in tissue, but in the architecture of memory itself. The queen's venom contains compounds science still hasn't fully identified. Peptides that seem specifically engineered to target the parts of the brain that process suffering and amplify them beyond what should be biologically possible. And the most terrifying part: There are probably worse stings out there. Species we haven't cataloged yet, living in rainforests we haven't fully explored, carrying venom cocktails that make even this sound merciful by comparison. But we need to go deeper into what number 1 actually means, because calling the Asian giant hornet queen sting the worst ever recorded does uncapture the full scope of what happens when that much venom enters human tissue. The Chinese farmer's case was documented, studied, and filed away in medical journals that most people will never read. But there are other cases whispered about in entomological circles. Stories that exist in the gray zone between verified incident and cautionary legend. In 2011, a beekeeper in Japan, a man who'd worked with insects for 30 years, who'd been stung thousands of times by everything from honeybees to yellowjackets, was called to remove a giant hornet nest from an abandoned warehouse. He made the mistake of assuming his experience made him immune to fear and possibly to pain. He wore his standard protective gear, a suit designed for honeybees, with mesh that could stop a worker hornet but wasn't designed for the queen stinger, which is less like a needle and more like a hypodermic nail. The nest was massive, a gray paper fortress the size of a refrigerator, and when he began the removal process, the queen emerged. She didn't flee, she attacked. Her stinger punched through 3 layers of his suit outer canvas, inner padding, and the cotton shirt beneath and buried itself in his upper chest, just below his collarbone. The injection lasted 3 full seconds, an eternity in venom delivery, as she emptied her glands in one catastrophic dose. The beekeeper's first thought, he said later, wasn't about pain. It was confusion, 'cause for about 5 seconds he felt nothing except pressure. Then his heart stuttered. Not metaphorically, his cardiac rhythm destabilized as the venom's peptides interfered with electrical signals in his myocardium. He collapsed, and the fall probably saved his life, because it knocked him away from the nest and the remaining workers that were preparing to join the assault. His apprentice found him 30 seconds later, convulsing on the warehouse floor, foam coming from his mouth, eyes rolled back so far only the whites showed. The ambulance took 14 minutes to arrive. During that time, the beekeeper experienced something he still can't fully articulate. He was conscious, trapped in his body, able to hear and feel everything but completely unable to move or speak. The pain had transcended sensation and become environment. He existed inside it, the way you exist inside a room. Except this room was made of fire and glass shards and electrical current, and there were no walls, no ceiling, no exit. Just infinite space filled with suffering. His apprentice held his hand and felt the bones grinding together from the force of his grip. Felt the muscles in his forearm cramping so hard they were tearing themselves apart. When the paramedics arrived and tried to administer morphine, it did nothing. Fentanyl did nothing. The venom had so completely saturated his pain receptors that opioids couldn't even compete for binding sites. They intubated him, sedated him with propofol, and put him in a medical coma, not to heal him, but simply to hide him from his own nervous system. He stayed under for 6 days. When they woke him, the first thing he did was try to tear out the 4th lines. Because some primitive part of his brain still believed he was being stung, that the pain was still happening. It took 3 nurses to hold him down while a psychiatrist talked him back to reality. The physical damage was extensive tissue necrosis at the sting site required surgical debridement, removing a divot of dead flesh the size of a poker chip. But the psychological damage ran deeper. He developed a rare condition called allodynia, where normal touch becomes painful. For 8 months, wearing a shirt felt like being scraped with sandpaper. A handshake was agony. His wife couldn't hug him. He slept sitting up because the pressure of a mattress against his back triggered phantom sting sensations that made him scream. Neurologists explained that the venom had essentially rewired his pain pathways, creating new neural connections that his brain didn't know how to shut down. He underwent experimental treatment nerve blocks, ketamine therapy. even hypnosis before finally regaining something resembling a normal life. But he never went near insects again. His apprentice took over the business. The protective suit he was wearing that day is now preserved in a medical museum in Osaka. The hole in the chest clearly visible, a reminder that some creatures carry weapons we're simply not equipped to survive. And here's what keeps entomologists awake at night. That beekeeper got stung once. The Chinese farmer took 64 stings, but only one from the queen. There are no recorded cases of someone surviving multiple queen stings in quick succession, because the few times it's happened, the victims died before reaching medical care. In 2016, a hiker in South Korea stumbled onto a nest and in the chaos of the attack was stung 3 times by what autopsy reports later confirmed were queen hornets. An almost impossibly rare scenario suggesting multiple queens or a nest in transition. His hiking partner tried to help him down the mountain but said his screams weren't human. They were the sounds an animal makes when it's being eaten alive. He made it 400 yards before his heart stopped. Resuscitation efforts failed. The coroner's report noted that his final expression was one of such extreme distress that several medical examiners requested psychological counseling after viewing the body. The venom had caused such widespread tissue damage that his blood had become acidic. His muscles had released enough potassium to poison his own heart, and his brain had swollen against his skull from the sheer stress response. The official cause of death was listed as multiple organ failure, secondary to envenomation, but everyone who worked that case knew the truth. He'd been tortured to death by chemistry, by millions of years of evolution that had refined suffering into a liquid and packaged it in a stinger. This is the throne. This is the undisputed king of pain. Not because it kills plenty of venoms are more lethal, but because it redefines what it means to suffer. The Schmidt Pain Index stops at 4 because Schmidt ran out of language. Out of metaphors, out of ways to describe what exists beyond that threshold. The Asian giant hornet queen sting exists there, in that unmapped territory where pain stops being a symptom and becomes the entire disease. The entire world, the only thing that's real, and the worst part. These hornets are expanding their range. Climate change is pushing them north, into Korea, into Russia, and yes, into North America, where they've already established footholds in British Columbia and Washington state. Entomologists are racing to contain them. But containment assumes we can predict their behavior, map their nests, respond faster than they can reproduce. So far, we're losing. Which means the worst sting ever recorded might not stay rare for long. It might become common. Routine, just another hazard of living on a planet where we read not actually the apex predator, we read just the species that has been lucky enough not to piss off the real apex predators until recently. The aftermath of these stings extends far beyond the immediate agony. And that's what most people don't understand until it's too late. Pain fades. Tissue heals. But venom rewrites biology at a fundamental level, and some of those changes are permanent. Take the phenomenon of sensitization. After a severe sting, the immune system doesn't just remember the venom, it becomes hypervigilant, primed to overreact the next time. A person who survives a bullet ant sting might develop anaphylaxis to a common honeybee years later, even if they'd been stung by bees dozens of times before without issue. The immune system, traumatized by the ponerotoxin, starts treating all hymenopteran venom as an existential threat. Doctors call it cross-reactivity. Victims call it a life sentence, because it means every wasp, every bee, every yellow jacket becomes a potential execution, carrying a threat that has nothing to do with pain and everything to do with suffocation, swelling, and cardiac arrest. Then there's the neurological legacy. A study published in 2018 followed 47 people who experienced severe stings from insects rated 3 or higher on the Schmidt Index. 5 years post-sting, 62% reported chronic pain conditions that hadn't existed before. Fibromyalgia, migraines, neuropathy. Their nervous systems had been so thoroughly traumatized that they'd essentially become stuck in a heightened pain state, interpreting normal signals as threats. One woman in the study, stung by a tarantula hawk wasp in Nevada, developed such severe photophobia that she couldn't go outside during daylight without wearing welding goggles. Her neurologist believed the venom had damaged her trigeminal nerve in a way that made her brain process light as pain. She lost her job, her marriage collapsed. She attempted suicide twice before finally finding a cocktail of medications that brought her pain down to manageable levels. When researchers interviewed her for the study, she said something that appears in the published paper as a direct quote. "I did unsurvive the sting. The person I was died on that hiking trail. What came back is something else, something broken. And we have to talk about the evolutionary implications because these venoms aren't accidents. They're not side effects of some other biological process. They are the process. Every compound, every peptide, every enzymatic trigger has been refined over millions of years for one purpose: to inflict maximum suffering with minimum venom expenditure. The bullet ant doesn't need to kill you. It needs you to remember, to carry that memory back to your tribe or your colony. To teach every organism in your social group that this ant is untouchable. The same logic applies to the giant hornet queen. Her venom is so devastating not because she's defending herself, but because she's defending thousands of offspring. An entire genetic legacy and evolution has calculated that the most effective defense isn't lethality, it's legend. One person stung, screaming, traumatized, spreading stories that keep everyone else at bay for generations. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's brilliant. From a human standpoint, it's nightmare fuel. There are cases we can't even verify. Stories that filter through scientific communities like ghost tales. A missionary in Papua New Guinea who was allegedly stung by an unknown wasp species and became catatonic, unable to speak or move for 3 days while somehow remaining conscious, his eyes tracking movement, tears streaming down his face until the venom finally metabolized and he collapsed into a 30-hour sleep. A logger in the Congo who was found wandering the forest, having gnawed through his own tongue during convulsions triggered by a sting no one saw happen, the insect never identified. A researcher in the Amazon who was stung during a storm with no witnesses and no specimen recovered, who later described the pain as green. Not metaphorically, but synesthetically, as if the venom had crossed his sensory wires and made pain visible as a color. These stories exist in the margins of entomological literature, footnotes, and rumors because they can't be confirmed. But they persist. And the question they raise is terrifying. If the worst sting ever recorded is from a species we know, what's waiting in the parts of the world we haven't fully explored? What's living in the canopy layers of rainforests that have never been surveyed? In cave systems that haven't been mapped? On islands where no entomologist has ever set foot? The Schmidt Pain Index ends at 4, not because 4 is the limit, but because Schmidt stopped looking. He achieved what he set out to do: create a framework for comparing stings. But frameworks have edges, and beyond those edges is territory that might not be survivable enough to document. There are whispers of a wasp in the Philippines, never scientifically described, that locals call the widowmaker, because men stung by it often die not from the venom, but from shock-induced heart attacks. There's a species of ant in Madagascar, rumored to have venom that causes temporary blindness, a neurotoxin that disrupts the optic nerve for anywhere from 6 hours to 3 days. These aren't confirmed. They might be folklore. But every piece of folklore starts somewhere. And in entomology, where we've cataloged less than 20% of insect species on Earth, the odds are good that something worse is out there, waiting to be discovered by someone unlucky enough to step on the wrong nest or brush against the wrong branch. And then there's climate change, which isn't just expanding the ranges of known species, accelerating their evolution. Insects in warming climates are adapting faster than we can study them, and some of those adaptations involve venom. Hotter temperatures mean faster metabolisms, which can mean more concentrated venom production. Longer summers mean longer breeding seasons, which mean larger colonies, which mean more defensive behavior. We're creating conditions that select for more aggressive, more venomous insects, and we're doing it globally, all at once. The Asian giant hornet's arrival in North America isn't an invasion, it's a preview. It's the opening act of a shift where the insects that have lived in equilibrium with their environments for millennia are suddenly under pressure. Suddenly, in competition with new species, suddenly evolving new defensive strategies because the old ones are uncutting it anymore. So when we talk about the worst insect sting ever recorded, we have to acknowledge that ever recorded is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It means the worst we know about. The worst we've survived long enough to document. The worst that has happened in a place where medical care was accessible and case studies could be written. But the actual worst sting might have happened in 1987 in a Borneo jungle, with no witnesses and no survivors. It might have happened last week in the Amazon. The victim's body never found. The insect never identified. It might happen tomorrow to someone reading this, because the insects on this list aren't hypothetical threats. They're real, they're spreading, and the distance between you and them is shrinking every year. The bullet ant is in your hemisphere. The giant hornet is in your country. And somewhere, in some forest or desert or island you've never heard of, there's something worse, something carrying venom that would make every sting on this list feel like a mercy by comparison. This is the reality we've inherited. We share this planet with creatures that have weaponized agony, that have turned suffering into an art form, and we're just now beginning to understand how sophisticated, how refined, how absolutely devastating those weapons can be. The Schmidt Pain Index was never meant to be complete. It was meant to be a warning. And if you've made it this far, if you've walked through every level of that warning, you understand now that pain isn't just a biological response, it's a language. And some insects are so fluent in that language that they can speak directly to the most primitive parts of your brain. The parts that existed before words, before reason, before anything except the desperate, overwhelming need to make it stop. But what if I told you there's something even worse waiting in the shadows? Something that makes these stings feel like a paper cut. Click the video on screen right now. The most venomous creatures that can kill you in seconds.